Hello, we've started the meeting.
All right, I'll just wait a minute as attendees trickle in before getting started, but we'll start in just a minute. All right, so I'll go ahead and get started now then. Thanks everyone for joining. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those joining from around the world. My name is Elizabeth Sutherland. I am a program associate at the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs on our democracy and technology team. Today, I'm going to be discussing the impacts of 5G on the future of Africa's internet freedom and how democratic stakeholders can empower leaders to make informed decisions about 5G adoption and governance. Today's discussion builds on NDI's findings in our white paper on 5G and the future internet, implications for developing democracies and human rights, which we published earlier this year. NDI became quite interested in 5G as part of our overall work on emerging technologies and how they impact democracy and human rights. But when we set out to do this research, we realized that this was quite an unexplored space. There's a lot out there about the security and the economic implications of 5G, but very little about the consequences and what they may be for democracy and human rights. Efforts so far have been on the margins of the technology community, the margins of the democracy community, and so our white paper was the beginning of an effort to bring these threads together and ensure that decisions on 5G are made with these issues in mind. Our paper has three central findings to take away. First, while any 5G-backed technology could benefit a democratic information space, inclusion and participation, and human rights, illiberal actors are using the same tools to drown out dissent and suppress those rights in closing spaces. We learned from the transition from 3G to 4G and the associated rise in digital repression, disinformation, and surveillance that authoritarians will quickly co-opt these technologies as they're introduced. Second is that despite the risks, a majority of the countries where NDI works, both worldwide and in Africa, are pursuing 5G contracts with companies with close ties to the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party. Widespread bans on companies like Huawei are unlikely and they're unrealistic. The rollout of this 5G technology will thus have an impact on all of our partners in developing democracies and closing spaces alike. Third and finally, 5G standards bodies lack representation from civil society and from the global south in particular. As illiberal actors are trying to increase their influence in these global standards bodies on 5G and other future internet issues, democratic actors need to work across sectors to advance technology that upholds democratic norms and human rights. So before we dive fully into it, I think it's helpful to provide a brief overview of what 5G actually is and what it can do and what makes it different from previous generations of the internet. So without getting too far into the technical weeds, in a 5G network, these radio access networks, or RANs, as you'll see in this diagram here, provide coverage through local cell towers that can transmit data to and from your devices. In previous generations, most of the data processing would have been done in the core of a network, but under a 5G network, these radio access towers outside of the core, in the periphery, have more control over processing and transmitting data. This makes the equipment for these radio access networks a focus in the cybersecurity framework. Currently, Huawei is the leading RAN distributor, followed by Nokia, and there are a number of other companies that are also in this space. 5G is expected to be 100 times faster than previous generations, with 1,000 times higher capacity for data flow than previous generations. This is going to enable machine-to-machine communication, fast, reliable connectivity, and a greater data flow. This increased speed and power will transform the internet as we know it, enabling an enormous Internet of Things, advancing artificial intelligence, and powering smart cities. These 5G networks are going to enable flows of data to power critical infrastructure and to transmit content that informs us and shapes our perceptions. One of the strengths of 5G is that this core and periphery of the network are one. However, like a new car that you get with a faulty engine, this decentralized, interdependent nature of the 5G system means that a vulnerability in one part can have rippling effects across the rest of the network. These vulnerabilities include privacy violations, data loss or misuse, equipment quality and data integrity issues, network surveillance, censorship or internet shutdowns, critical network attacks, and the costs of this long-term risk mitigation to ensure that these things don't occur. But despite these security risks, 5G is a question of when, not if. The immense economic opportunities it presents just can't be passed up. But those economic opportunities shouldn't have to come at the cost of compromising security, transparency, privacy, or integrity. NDI's research found that 69 countries have already signed non-restrictive contracts with Huawei out of the 170 where the company operates. Its expansive presence in 2G, 3G, 4G, all of these previous generations of networks helps to further spread their reach. When it comes to the African continent specifically, we found 6 African countries have signed agreements with 5G equipment vendors with a dedicated human rights strategy, such as Ericsson, Nokia, or Samsung, compared to the nearly 40 countries contracting with companies like Huawei or ZTE that have close ties to the Chinese Communist Party. Outright bans on Huawei or ZTE are unlikely and unrealistic. In fact, the ban the United States enacted in 2019 on the use of Huawei in 5G networks put many African nations in a difficult position. There are significant cybersecurity concerns that led the US and others to reconsider the use of Huawei technology in these networks. But currently, there's no other company on the market that's providing a better economic offer in terms of the price of the hardware for these systems. The former Minister of Public Works of Liberia has gone so far as to say that Africa's future internet will depend on components at a price that only Chinese companies can provide. And it's expected that governments are going to prioritize closing the digital divide through affordable technology and getting 5G rolled out that way over concerns around cybersecurity. This focus on espionage and national security has moved the conversation away from how the technologies of 5G and the future internet are going to permeate governance, both in Africa and around the world, instead honing in on that concern of espionage. But because these bans are unlikely, it's even more crucial that democratic actors are aware of both the opportunities and the risks from a rights perspective. So when it comes to opportunities and risks for democracy and for human rights, 5G is going to be a bit of a mixed bag, some positive and some negative implications. Any 5G-backed technology could promise to increase the scope of democratic information spaces, improve citizen participation, and improve human rights outcomes. But as mentioned before, illiberal actors are using these same tools to drown out and suppress these spaces and these rights within emerging democracies. 5G networks are expected to be more secure than previous generations as the technology improves. And in these open spaces, increased data flow could be a powerful tool for free speech. But as technology evolves, so do its risks. And these weak networks can be vulnerable to information manipulation, surveillance, and censorship, particularly in closed and closing spaces. So when it comes to mobilization and innovation, the outcomes and expected impacts for democracy are generally positive. 5G could accelerate technological innovation that leads to better governance. Improved data flows in democracies can also support free and fair elections, free speech, and innovations in how citizens mobilize and communicate with one another. But when it comes to human rights and democratic processes, the outlook is a little more uncertain. Government control of 5G infrastructures could be detrimental to the integrity of information, to free speech, and to democratic participation in closing spaces, particularly if they're used for surveillance or censorship. And as more and more connected devices rely on 5G in the Internet of Things, cyber attackers could exploit vulnerabilities to undermine democratic processes like elections, in addition to attacking other critical infrastructures. Finally, mass surveillance augmented by artificial intelligence and 5G and those data flows could empower mass human rights abuses and mass discrimination on a scale that we just have not seen before. And finally, when it comes to social and democratic unity, the micro-targeting and dissemination of misinformation that 5G will enable will occur at a scale that can erode trust in institutions, in the media, and in one another. All in all, in countries that are inclined towards authoritarianism, 5G will make it efficient by expanding the scope and the scale of illiberal capabilities to surveil, to censor, and to manipulate. This potential for 5G to expand illiberal capabilities is of particular concern in Africa, where internet shutdowns and surveillance are regular tactics used by aspiring autocrats to maintain grips on power. As African governments are pursuing 5G contracts with companies tied to the Chinese Communist Party, which has no reservations about surveilling dissidents or silencing dissent, it's easy to imagine a future where autocrats using Huawei or ZTE hardware follow the CCP's vision of cyber sovereignty and a splintered internet, bringing cheap technology at the hidden cost of a closing civic space and a mass surveillance regime. But it doesn't have to be that bad. The GSMA estimates that 5G will only account for about 3% of African internet connections by 2025. This lag in 5G rollout means that governments, civil society groups, and other stakeholders have an opportunity to begin planning now for how to roll out this next generation of the internet in a way that harnesses its economic benefits while still respecting human rights. Blanket bans on companies like Huawei are unlikely, but countries across Africa currently are facing this window of opportunity to set the norms and standards for the use and the governance of future internet technologies in ways that uphold digital human rights and democratic principles, regardless of who the technology vendor is. So given the serious potential harms that 5G could have on democratic norms, it's crucial that actors are able to exercise an oversight role over 5G decision-making and standards. But these government decisions are often made in executive branches without parliamentary oversight, and civil society organizations are often left without voices in larger standard-setting bodies. Parliaments may not be adequately prepared or to govern technical 5G issues. While there have been a number of companies, Ericsson comes to mind as kind of a leader in this area, that have put forward human rights impact assessments for 5G, the private sector alone can't continue to drive these conversations. It needs to have a multi-stakeholder input. So democratic actors need to work together across sectors, whether it's private sector, civil society, government, to advance technological advancements that uphold democratic norms and these human rights. So where can stakeholders take action? Based on our research, we are exploring a few entry points for engaging with democracy stakeholders on 5G issues. And I've broken a couple of our findings out here across different stakeholder groups. So civil society organizations have a really important role to play in understanding the risks and translating them to local contexts. Civil society can identify and build key alliances and influential networks to advocate for rights-based uses of technology. And civil society can educate the public and particularly the communities that will be most impacted by 5G. Finally, civil society can also galvanize public pressure and expose when exploitation of technology occurs, either by a company or by a government. When it comes to legislatures, legislators can have a role to play in advocating for research and development into future internet innovation, both diverse solutions and diverse vendors to prevent any over-reliance on any particular vendor or company. Legislatures can also play a role by updating regulation to protect privacy of data, to protect human rights, and to defend and set standards for an open internet. Legislatures can also incentivize 5G investments in marginalized communities to ensure that the effects and the benefits that are reaped by this technology, economic and social, are spread evenly and equitably across societies, and that this continues to close rather than to further broaden the digital divide. And finally, legislatures can also work with the relevant agencies to align their 5G objectives with their democratic values in development assistance partnerships, telecommunications bids, and spectrum allocation to ensure that all of these processes that lead to these 5G contracts are done in an open and accountable way. Finally, when it comes to global standards bodies, this is really the place to develop rights-based policy and standards proposals that will be relevant to global forums. Global standards bodies can also build stronger alliances and regional approaches to influence the ITU, the 3GPP, and other standards bodies where decisions internationally on a global level about 5G are being made. So with all of that said, where kind of to go from here? NDI's work on 5G is ongoing. We're currently working on identifying approaches that will enable all of these different stakeholders to effectively exercise that oversight and to have a voice in decision-making forums on 5G. We're also working to identify the best framing for technology policies, regulations, laws, and global standards that will protect rights and democracy. And we're developing strategies to engage companies and hold them accountable when they comply with illiberal abuse of technology. We'll be working to kind of pilot this methodology in the coming months and look forward to sharing it in the future once we've kind of piloted it and received feedback. So yeah, thank you all so much. That's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to open it up to question and answer. Yeah, feel free to drop in the chat box or the Q&A function if you have any questions or other comments or thoughts. I'd love to open it up for discussion. All right, well, if there aren't any questions, I'm happy to kind of stick around in case anyone has any follow-ups. I'll also share in the chat the link to our white paper on 5G and democracy and human rights for anyone who's curious, who'd like to read it. But in the meantime, I'm happy to stick around until the next lightning talk gets started. Oh, great. Yeah, I see we have a question in the chat about if 5G in Africa is gaining momentum. Yeah, that's a great question. So a number of countries have begun to explore contracts and memoranda of understanding with companies about rolling 5G out in the future. At this time, it's kind of rollouts and actual implementations of 5G networks are fairly limited. There have been a number in South Africa, and a few in other, mostly within, large cities, capitals, urban areas. There hasn't yet been much kind of widespread implementation of 5G networks. I think currently the GSMA estimates that about 3% of African internet connections will be 5G by 2025. So there's going to be a little bit of a kind of a later rollout, which has some benefits in the sense that by the time that it is rolled out across many African countries, the technology will be a little bit more mature, and there will be some more kind of single purpose 5G networks as opposed to kind of 4G LTE, 5G kind of multi-use networks. And this especially, while we kind of have until this 2025 or so, at which point it's expected things will speed up, there's, this kind of window of opportunity for setting the standards now in order to ensure that when it is rolled out, this technology does respect human rights and uphold, democratic norms of an open internet and, protecting internet freedom. And I'll drop, so dropping the link to the paper in the chat now, if anyone's curious. And we do have kind of a global overview of countries listed in there of kind of the timelines of 5G rollouts worldwide. But yeah, thank you so much for your question.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing those insights. Much appreciated. Lots of food for thought there. We can go ahead to the next speaker, as I'm sure a few more questions may come up. There's been quite a lot to think about. So yes, we can go ahead to the next speaker as we think about more, and perhaps we might get inspired to ask a few more in relation to the two topics that have been presented. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much. Blaze and I are taking the next session, but I'm unable to share my screen. If you can assist us with that. It's taking me a bit of time. Blaze, do you mind sharing your screen? I've just shared the document, so you can go ahead. Blaze, are you with us? Yes, awesome.
See my screen?
Yeah, I can. So you can just put it in presentation mode.
Khadija, do you want to start or can take over?
You can go ahead. You have the first round. Yeah. So just click on present. So it's a bit, because I can see your whole screen, your millions of tabs.
So now it's better. Is it okay now?
Not yet on my end.
Oh. Okay, let me try once. Yeah, can you see my screen now?
Yes, but I'm seeing removing fears of digitization.
Oh, interested.
I think you can just go ahead while we figure it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, everybody, and welcome to this session. My name is Blaze. I'm a policy lead within the Tech for Development Policy Unit at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. My work basically is centered around thought leadership on how to build and help the lower and marginalized communities harness the benefits of the tech revolution. And I've done or co-authored papers and reports on digital identity, digital governance, all within the Institute. But previously, I have a background in tech startup, co-founded an e-commerce startup, a fintech blockchain startup out of Africa. And yeah, it's great to be here and to share my experiences and how we can build robust digital identity systems for Africa. So in this presentation, I'll take the first session and Khadija would follow up on the next session on data privacy for digital identity. For the first section, we're going to look at what is digital identity, what are the opportunities for governments and policymakers, some of the risks that come with digital identity and how to mitigate against them, and key policy recommendations for governments who want to implement digital identity systems within their economies. To start with, digital identity and its rollout by governments remains a topical issue among citizens and civil society. Concerns have been raised, for instance, about the potential risks associated with its usage by capricious governments to target marginalized communities. And policymakers must recognize this when designing digital identity solutions. The Tony Blair Institute recently organized a governmental level roundtable discussion on digital identity, and leaders largely agreed that there's the need to implement the necessary safeguards for digital identity systems. For instance, the case of Kenya, where citizens pushed back and actually compelled the government to provide a legislation backing its digital identity system, is an example. With digital identities, citizens must come first. After looking at a cautionary note, what is digital identity and what forms does it take? Digital identity is a legal form of identity that allows an individual to prove who they are, either online or offline, and which can be reused without the need of a physical card to access different services, either within the private sector or the public sector. In Africa, Rwanda, Algeria, Kenya, and Nigeria are known to have implemented a form of digital identity. We recognize that whilst there's a transition towards the building of single foundational digital IDs, in the case of Rwanda, for example, we still see use cases for functional digital IDs, such as Nigeria's BVN, which is key in the financial sector. In several contexts, however, functional IDs, such as driver's licenses, have evolved to become foundational ID. Examples include Bangladesh, Haiti, and Mexico, where the voter ID system has become the de facto national identity card. Although this can be a good way to build foundational IDs, that's transitioning from a functional ID to a foundational ID, it needs to be carefully planned. Specifically, if a functional ID is used for a purpose it has not been designed or developed for, problems can be created for the users and institutions providing these services. As countries invest in closing the identity gap, they have an opportunity to build identity systems that are interoperable, that is, they work across borders and across sectors within their economies. But these IDs, interoperable ID systems, must put the people first at the center and leapfrog existing and expensive legacy systems that we have. After looking at what the concept of digital ID is and its forms, what are the opportunities it presents for African economies? The opportunity for countries in Africa is vast, and we've seen a trend where policymakers have realized this and are making efforts to harness its benefits. The AU, for instance, the African Union, I must say, is working on several cross-continental initiatives. And African countries that are currently working on digital ID programs include the Angola, Ethiopia, Kenya, Sierra Leone, Morocco, Nigeria, Rwanda, Togo, and Uganda. We can see a trend and a wave towards adoption of digital ID within the economies. However, safeguards must be put in place, and my colleague will talk about these at the end of the session. Efforts in many countries have stalled either as a result of low uptake or implementation and governance challenges with digital ID systems. For instance, again, Nigeria's national identity management system has been adopted by just 20% of its population. There are lessons, however, in the achievements of nations or countries such as Rwanda, India, and Estonia when it comes to the implementation of digital identity systems. And other countries can draw from these positive experiences. Rwanda's national identity card and India's Aadhaar ID system, as well as Estonia's eID, all have over 90% or higher adoption rate and are used by residents to access both government services. And we're also seeing use cases for private sector adoption as well, especially in the case of India and Estonia. Beyond the case for governance and inclusion, we are also seeing benefits for economic growth. It is estimated that universal digital ID could create economic opportunities to the value of equivalent to 6% of GDPs in emerging economies by 2020. And in addition, it can save governments and the private sector up to 110 billion hours of work through streamlined systems. Digital ID can also help companies that are within the private sector to reduce their operating costs associated with regulatory compliance and widen their customer base because it makes it easy to onboard customers and generate new markets. Because if we have an interoperable continental ID systems, a business in Ghana, for instance, can operate smoothly and onboard customers in Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire, and Togo. And it's something that in my previous work as an entrepreneur I faced, because my company had to spend a lot of time verifying identities of our customers, and this could take close to a week through back and forth emails and verifying documents. With an ID, this is streamlined, and we could do this within the day or even within 1 or 2 hours and make it easy to provide better services to the customers. The second benefit of digital ID is for the users as well as governments who are providing social services and social support. Digital ID, for instance, enables the individual to access wide-growing governmental level services, such as social insurance, and also cash transfers, as well as help them engage in civic opportunities, such as elections. As digital ID, and again, digital ID can help to identify and reach the poorest within our society for better social protection incentives. The Brookings Institute, for instance, estimates that universal digital ID could erase extreme poverty at a global level at the cost of around 100 billion through cash transfers. Broadening access to digital ID could also help with the progress towards achieving the UN SDGs of legal identity for all, including birth, by 2030. We see that digitalization of basic services is happening across the developing world with a 20% year-on-year growth in internet usage and access. This presents a fertile opportunity for rollout of digital identity systems whilst maintaining or mitigating the potential risks. But governments need to ensure that all their citizens, and not just a few, especially the rich and those with better internet connections, are able to share in the dividends of a transformation. In effect, it must be inclusive and benefit everybody. Having looked at the potential benefits of digital ID for the private sector as well as the public sector, especially for citizens, for governments, and the companies within the private sector, there are some measures that can be put in place to mitigate the risk and make sure the benefits are evenly distributed. One, we see the potential that we can leverage existing digital infrastructure to roll out digital identity systems. In the absence of the appropriate infrastructure and skills, governments or policymakers risk low adoption and further widening the digital divide, which is not what we need. To avoid low digital ID uptake and participation, there is the need to expand basic infrastructure or foundational infrastructure, such as internet, electricity, as well as improving the digital literacy among citizens. And digital literacy is key to helping citizens be responsible and control how their digital information is either used or shared. In the short term, digital ID could be basic and simple to use with little sophistication. It means that they should be so simple and easy for my aunt or my grandmother in the village to use them with little hesitation. Internet-free access via USSD is a key way to achieving this and reducing the adoption curve for the less digital savvy populations. We think that lessons could be drawn from the success of mobile money and its adoption across the continent. A second risk mitigation factor will be political exploitation. In as much as the digital ID systems have the benefits, they may also reinforce existing political dynamics too. We've seen this in several countries. I'll mention just a few. In Venezuela, digital identities and identification have been used as a tool for social control, whilst in Jamaica, the system has been criticized by civil society for being divisive and exclusionary. Hence, we need to build systems with an enabling environment in which digital technologies can develop in tandem with robust frameworks to govern and regulate them. And there again, my colleague is going to touch more on some of these issues. Having looked at the potential, how to mitigate the risk and how best governments can do this within our continent, we propose some key recommendations that policymakers must take into consideration when building robust digital ID systems within the African economy. First, design with and for the users. In essence, the value of any digital ID system to its users will determine its adoption rate. And with a higher adoption rate, it also in turn influences or determines its intrinsic value. Therefore, consulting users as systems are developed and establishing a robust feedback loop to understand and address problems as they emerge is key in the design process. The African Union Digital ID Framework consultative process is a good step, and policymakers, governments are encouraged to participate in the process and help shape the framework that is due to be launched. Government should also expand dialogue with both the private sectors as well as civil society to ensure that user rights are considered and also safeguard measures at every stage of the process are ensured. Number two, second recommendation, I should say, is that governments need to govern digital identity frameworks with clarity. There should be no ambiguities. Hence, digital ID systems are developing faster than the regulatory frameworks that seek to protect users. And we've seen how technology often outpaces legal systems and frameworks. This imbalance needs to be addressed if we want to safeguard user rights and user data within digital identity systems. So several alliances have proposed good ID principles that should govern digital ID. And some governments and regional bodies are taking steps to better regulate digital ID and protect data privacy. And we see a classical example with the case of Kenya, and I mentioned the pushback initially. Now the government has been able to secure a law on data protection to govern digital identity as well. Third recommendation, African governments need to build a flourishing local tech ecosystem. We think this is essential because engaging the private sector to ensure that digital ID can be used to access private services as well as public services provided by these the private sector companies is essential. It is important to get financial services providers, on board early in the process, because once digital identity becomes a key to accessing key financial services, we see the potential for financial inclusion, and users can easily see its value and adopt digital identity systems. For instance, the private sector organizations who have adopted digital identities have seen an increase in their revenues. And once this value is demonstrated, we think that other companies would come on board to help govern the process and make sure that there are safeguards for better digital identity systems and also the adoption of digital identity for economic growth. Number 4, plan for global use. Interoperability across borders of digital identity can increase and enable trade and orderly migration of citizens without segregation or discrimination. This means that policy measures must commit to common standards, and common standards in technology services that govern the software and hardware components of ID systems is important. This makes sure that machine-to-machine communication for interoperability, as well as data standards that govern the format and structure of the data collected within the ID systems, are well designed and agreed amongst all the stakeholders, and also across borders as well. We should also commit to common standards for infrastructure. This is important because as we seek to build strong procurement practices that reduce the cost of procuring services, the adoption of international standards can drive down the cost and minimize unnecessary constraints in the choice of technology or supplier. And this would help to ensure that the system can adopt and adapt to take advantage of new solutions. Lastly, global coalitions are necessary to accelerate the progress. Alliances such as the ID 2020, which is seeking to build international coalitions of governments, private sector actors, as well as civil society around safe and effective digital ID systems, are welcome news. Again, the World Bank and the Good ID principles or framework have developed common framework or common tools that should guide governments and policymakers in the design of digital identity systems. Here again, the AU Digital Identity Framework is a good guide for countries across the region looking to implement an ID system. Within the African continent, we see the potential for the African Continental Free Trade Area to guide the implementation of transnational digital ID systems to reduce trade barriers by easing access to services across the continent, and to accelerate the process for a common database which could be maintained by a consortium of governments and private sector organizations to gather or aggregate digital identity data from member countries for transnational digital identity system. Having looked at digital identity, what it is, some of the potential risks and how to mitigate them, the opportunities, and some key recommendations, I'll conclude by saying that identity is a human right. And in this modern world, that identity should be digital. However, at the heart of efforts to extend digital identity to all citizens, we need to see user-centered design, strong governance frameworks based on emergent principles, as well as regional and global corporations that take the best from existing systems to promote international operability. Doing so requires the infrastructure for connectivity, digital literacy, access to electricity to ensure widespread access and adoption. But we must conclude by saying that systems must be designed with inclusion as a driving principle and not exclusion as well. I'll then hand over to my colleague, Khadija, to look at the data and privacy protection bit of digital identity and how to make it safe and secure for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Blaise. I don't know, I feel like I should have just left it all to you. You did a fantastic job with the session. Thank you. So my name is Khadija Usman. I'm the Program Officer for Anglophone West Africa at Paradigm Initiative. And for those of you who do not know Paradigm Initiative, we are a social enterprise that focuses on connecting youth to digital opportunities through our digital inclusion, digital rights, and policy programs. So getting right into it. Blaise has told you everything that you need to know about digital identity. And now you know that it could potentially create for many people access to health, education, social protection, and other vital services. It's all good on paper, but this would be in an ideal world. But we do know that we do not live in an ideal world. So the governments of the world, these institutions that are generally saddled with the responsibility to protect people, could potentially abuse that power. And in order to protect all involved, data protection is necessary. This is because when we're talking about digital identity, this is usually done by states. So what is data protection? It's the process of safeguarding important information from corruption, compromise, or loss. You could also refer to it as a set of strategies and processes that can help secure the privacy, availability, and integrity of data. Data protection becomes more important with the increase in the amount of data that is created and stored. And this brings to mind the massive amounts of data that is usually used when it comes to digital identity management. We're talking millions and millions of people. So when putting together digital identity programs, there are certain key considerations that must be put in. There are things that need to be considered, especially when considering the digital identity and data protection dilemma. The first of this is purpose limitation. Countries and governments should not use the data a person provides specifically for digital identity verification for any other purposes, except where it is allowed by law and the individual's permission. It would, because this would significantly undermine public trust in the framework. And this is one of the reasons why it has been difficult for many countries in Africa to put together the digital identity management process. There is also automated processes to consider. So the concerns and potential risks that may arise for individuals if digital identity and its attribution systems are completely automated are very valid. This could include the use of algorithms or artificial intelligence for the system. As such, the processes when it comes to automated processing need to be transparent. It needs to be as accurate as possible with redress mechanisms in place. There is also the third thing to consider is children's information, because children generally merit specific protection due to the risk that it could potentially come to them by collecting their information and their data. Any digital identity system must give special consideration to how it safely accommodates and protects children. Number 4 on this list is fair and lawful processing. It's important that individuals are offered the genuine choice over whether or not this is a process that they want to be a part of. So states need to be particularly careful when seeking consent and be explicit in the need or the use of consent. Digital identity technology must also comply with the legal requirements of data protection and privacy. It must fulfill the rights to life, a private life, home, and correspondences. On the next on this list is transparency, which I had mentioned before, in communicating the process for getting these digital identities. It must be transparent. Every information that needs to be had must be said. It must be user-friendly, like Blaise said. It must be easily understood, especially to those who are not tech savvy or technical specialists. Number 6 on this list is data minimization. States must ensure that the personal data that they collect is adequate, relevant, and limited to what is necessary for the purpose that it is being processed for. States do not need to collect 10 pages of information where it isn't necessary. The state does not need to know the village that your partner last visited. So just by the side. This is because when acquiring and using and retaining this information, using a minimal amount of data reduces any sort of privacy risk. As such, states should only have access to what they need. And finally on this list is security. All digital identity schemes need to be based on strong technical and organizational security arrangements. This is because the amount of data that is usually collected is very attractive to the bad actors in the market, and measures must be taken that have the largest considerable privacy enhancing technology to minimize the risk of fraud, impersonation, misuse, and loss of data. So the question is, where is Africa with this? Many African countries still struggle with data protection. They either lack data protection laws or lack data protection authorities. And as we know, Africans can be a very communal people and do not care as much about data protection. And now for the African countries that do have data protection authorities, they are grappling with independence and enforcement. And laws, as we know, are only good as their enforcement. So with the enactment of the Cape Verdean Data Protection Act in 2001, we can say that data protection is as old as 20 years old in Africa. However, the first data protection authority in Africa was established in Burkina Faso in 2007, since the Cape Verdean Act merely provided for a data protection authority, but did not set it up until 2015. In African countries, experience has shown that while the passage of data protection laws are one thing, the commencement date and ultimately their enforcement are a different story entirely. So as at June 2021, only 32 African countries had fully enacted dedicated data protection legislations, but the data protection authorities responsible for compliance and enforcement had volunteered very little information as to their investigative activities, their decision-making activities to the public. The activities have been very elusive and lacking in independence. Paradigm Initiative very recently launched a data protection authorities report that is accessible to the public. In terms of violations, an example would be that in Nigeria very recently, a mobile USSD code allowed anyone with the last name and date of birth of any individual to access their national identity number. This security lapse was only rectified following the litigation of civil society. And for those of us in civil society, our role when it comes to data protection vis-a-vis digital identity is very clear. We need to guide government policy and hold them accountable with all the tools available in our arsenal, from lobbying to litigation, to ensure the safety for all. In concluding, I would say recommendations or things to consider, depending on what stakeholder group you belong to, either government, civil society, or academia. Data protection must come before digital identity, or at the very least, they need to work hand in hand, because if there is no trust in this system, people would not voluntarily offer this information. Data protection laws need to be established in every country alongside independent data protection authorities with the sole purpose of enforcement and regulation. Because as I said, governments and states are the biggest processors of data. If the Data Protection Authority is not completely independent from the government, then it might make the entire process redundant. Data processing activities need to be open and transparent. They need to be user-friendly and put in a way that anyone, absolutely anyone on the street can understand. And of course, regardless of every safeguard that is put in place, breaches are still possible. And because of that, activities surrounding the remedies in place in times of such breach should be accessible to all. So with that, I would say I have concluded with this, and we would now open to any questions that anyone might have. Well, within the time, too. I'm sure Blaze would like to take that one. Can you see the question?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's a good question. As I indicated, we've seen in some cases where digital IDs have been used to, as I said, either restrict access to services. But that's why in the process, we need also a broader stakeholder engagement, especially with the private sector. So if private sector, the system is open up to the private sector, we likely going to have competition. And so if, let's say, one service provider restricts access, others have the potential to enjoy similar benefits from other providers. And that's from the angle of the private sector. Within the public sector, I think governments need to not restrict access to services based on digital ID. We advocate that we need to still allow non-digital ID based, if I should say, access to services that allow populations without digital ID to still access those same services. So digital ID shouldn't be a basis for exclusion. And in cases like this, would encourage maybe civil society organizations like Verdean to either through advocacy or through lawsuits, get governments to change or reverse such restrictions, because it is uncalled for to deny anybody any service because maybe they are not enrolled within the digital ID systems. We say tech neutrality should be key here, and as much as digital ID is good, allow other forms of access. So first, use the private sector, encourage participation there to lead to competition and broaden the scope of services available. But if these are government services, should either through seeking redress within the appropriate legal quarters to have these decisions reversed and allow everybody to participate in the process. But I see this emerging, even in the case of Ghana. For instance, there are moves towards denying you access to some services if you don't have a tax identification number, which is a form of like functional digital ID. And I think civil society should, be at the forefront to resist such actions. But if governments want to do so, make it easy for everybody to access or to be able to have access to digital ID without any restrictions. So broadening the infrastructure base, making it easy for access to this digital ID across the country. So we've seen that functional ID systems in Africa often are limited in scope. People in some villages don't have access. They can't even find the offices to go and create this account or even register for digital ID systems. So governments need to address these and provide alternatives. I think that's what I'll say, but where there are restrictions, I think would need either through legal means to reverse those actions, as well as advocacy to get governments or public agencies to reverse these. Khadija, if you have anything to add, that would be great.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on what you've said. So something that we did in Nigeria, which I think would be it will be great for other civil societies in this point of advocacy to replicate, was that we had for what we call the digital identity stakeholder engagement. So what we did was to bring the National Identity Management Commission in the room with people from different stakeholder groups, just so that the people can tell them what is actually on ground. You see, there are policies on paper, and then there's what usually happens. So what we did was we tried to bring as many people into the room. So Nigeria has 36 states. So we went to 4 of those states in different regions to get a feel of what is going on, what their own challenges are within those regions, and let the Identity Management Commission know so that they can improve on that process, while of course extending an arm to them to let them know that we are available to assist with whatever it is that they need. And something that came up during that time was that we had a particular session that had a lot of people living with disabilities, and the management, the identity management process took a lot of biometric information. So there were complaints about those who were amputees, did not have thumbs for thumbprints, and them being discriminated against. This was something that was taken into consideration, and they're now considering an iris scan, I believe, for those who might not have thumbprints. Another thing that did come up was, so they have a data protection, they have data protection policies, but because the process is very large scale in a way that is bigger than the commission, they now started to have, they had independent bodies that were registering people as well. Now, those people did not have as much, they did not respect data protection as much. And these things started to come up in a way that allowed them to go back to review these policies, the training, and an assessment of the type of independent contractors that do this work. So, just agreeing with what you said and sharing from the experience that Paradigm Initiative has had.
That was super helpful. If you have any more questions or if you want to make a contribution, please drop it in the chat as well.
It looks to me like there are no more questions or contributions. Yeah. Yeah, so just hoping the team would give us guidance on what next. What happens when there are no questions?
Well, thank you to our amazing speakers. We really appreciate the in-depth insights that you have brought to the forum. Once again, thank you very much. And to the participants, quiet as you are, we still know that you've taken a lot from the forum, and we look forward to those insights. Whenever they come, you can always share with us online. You can remember to use the hashtag Internet Freedom Africa or the hashtag Fifth Africa 21. Alternatively, you're always welcome to drop us a line. You can drop us a line at media@cipesa.org and we'll direct them to the necessary hosts. Once again, thank you very much to you all. We look forward to your further participation and contribution to the event online and offline when we eventually meet each other. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon, evening, and perhaps morning for some of you. Bye.
Thank you for hosting us.
Thank you so much.